The Mafia Boss discovered his right-hand man stole his power while he was away. But it was his trap. The rain hammered against the windshield of the black Cadillac as it wound through the narrow streets of Little Italy, Manhattan. Vinny Torino pressed his face against the cold glass, watching familiar storefronts blur past in the October darkness. 3 years. 3 years since he'd seen these streets, smelled the mix of garlic and exhaust that seemed to permeate every corner of his territory. "Boss, you sure about this?" Tommy Greco, his driver and longtime friend, glanced nervously in the rearview mirror. "Maybe we should have called ahead. Let people know you were coming back." Vinny's weathered face cracked into a thin smile. At 52, his black hair was now streaked with silver, and the lines around his eyes had deepened during his time away. But his dark eyes still held that predatory gleam that had made him one of the most feared men in New York's underworld. "Tommy, my friend." Vinny's voice was soft, almost gentle, a tone that those who knew him understood was far more dangerous than any shout. "Sometimes the best way to see what people really think of you is to show up when they don't expect you." The car turned onto Mulberry Street, and Vinny's jaw tightened, where his restaurant, Torino's, should have been blazing with light and bustling with the evening crowd. The windows were dark. A hand-painted sign hung crookedly in the window. "Under new management, Santangelo's." "Interesting," Vinny murmured, pulling out his phone. No missed calls from Marco Santangelo, his right-hand man for the past 15 years. No texts explaining why his most profitable legitimate business had apparently changed hands. He dialed Marco's number. "Vinny." Marco's voice sounded shocked, then quickly recovered. "Jesus Christ, when did you get back? I thought you were staying in Sicily until Christmas." "Change of plans, Marco. Meet me at the warehouse on Pier 47 in an hour." "The warehouse? Vinny, that place has been—" "1 hour, Marco." Vinny hung up and leaned back in the leather seat. Tommy caught his eye in the mirror. "What's the play, boss?" "Drive by Gino's social club, then the betting parlor on Grand Street. I want to see what else has changed while I was away." The tour of his territory revealed a systematic dismantling of everything he'd built over 20 years. Gino's social club, where his crew used to gather every evening to plan jobs and settle disputes, now had a "for rent" sign in the window. The betting parlor was boarded up. Even his numbers runner, old Mrs. Benedetto, was nowhere to be found at her usual corner newsstand. "Son of a bitch," Tommy muttered as they passed the fourth shuttered business. "The Marco's been busy." Vinny said nothing, but his fingers drummed steadily against his knee, a habit his late father had warned him about. "Never let them see you thinking, Vincent. A boss who shows emotion is a boss who shows weakness." The warehouse on Pier 47 sat like a hulking shadow against the East River. Vinny had bought it in 1998, using it primarily for storage and the occasional business meeting that required privacy. As Tommy parked beside the loading dock, Vinny could see light spilling from under the main door. "He's here early," Tommy observed. "Marco was always punctual. It's one of the things I liked about him." They walked through the side entrance, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The warehouse smelled of motor oil and salt water, with an underlying mustiness that spoke of years of disuse. Marco stood in the center of the space, his tall, lean frame silhouetted against a single hanging bulb. At 43, he still moved with the fluid grace that had made him Vinny's most effective enforcer in the early days. "Vinny," Marco's voice was carefully neutral. "You look good. Sicily agreed with you." "Did it?" Vinny stopped about 10 feet away, close enough to read Marco's face in the dim light. "I was hoping to come back to a thriving business, Marco. Instead, I find empty storefronts and for rent signs. Care to explain?" Marco's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the inside of his jacket. Tommy tensed beside Vinny, his own hand sliding toward his gun. But Vinny remained perfectly still, watching Marco's face with the intensity of a predator studying prey. "Things got complicated after you left," Marco said finally. "The FBI started sniffing around. We had to shut down operations, lay low. I was protecting what we built. By selling my restaurant to yourself." Marco's composure cracked slightly. "How did you—" "I make it my business to know things, Marco. Even from Sicily, especially from Sicily." Vinny took a step closer. "The question is, what were you planning to do when I came back? Assuming I came back at all." The warehouse fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic on the FDR drive and the lapping of water against the pier. Marco's eyes darted between Vinny and Tommy, calculating odds, measuring distances. "You think I betrayed you," Marco said. "I think you saw an opportunity when your boss disappeared for 3 years and decided to take it. I think you figured Vincent Torino was getting old, getting soft, and maybe it was time for new leadership." Vinny's voice remained calm, conversational. "The question is, what do we do about it now?" Marco's hand was definitely inside his jacket now. Tommy had moved slightly to the right, creating crossfire angles. The air in the warehouse felt electric with tension. "Vinny," Marco said carefully, "maybe we should talk about this somewhere more comfortable. My office." "Your office?" Vinny laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Marco, you don't have an office. You work for me, remember? Or did you forget that while you were playing dress-up as a boss?" That's when Marco went for his gun. Marco's hand had barely cleared his jacket when Tommy's .38 barked twice in the echoing warehouse. The shots were precise, professional. One in the shoulder, spinning Marco around, and one in the leg, dropping him to the oil-stained concrete floor. "Jesus, Tommy!" Marco gasped, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. "What the hell?" "Relax, Marco." Vinny walked over and kicked the fallen pistol away. "If Tommy wanted you dead, you'd be dead. Those were love taps." Marco struggled to sit up against a support beam, his face pale but his eyes still defiant. "You always were paranoid, Vinny. Seeing conspiracies everywhere." "Paranoid?" Vinny crouched down until he was eye level with his former lieutenant. "Let me tell you what I know, and you tell me if I'm being paranoid. I know that 2 weeks after I left for Sicily, you met with Joey Castellano at his cousin's bakery on Spring Street. I know that you've been systematically liquidating my assets and funneling the money through 3 different offshore accounts. I know that you've been telling people I'm not coming back, that I'm either dead or in hiding because the feds flipped me." Marco's eyes widened slightly with each revelation. "How could you possibly?" "Because I never left, you stupid bastard." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Tommy looked as shocked as Marco. Both men stared at Vinny as if he just sprouted wings. "What do you mean you never left?" Marco whispered. Vinny stood up, brushing dust from his knees. "I mean exactly what I said. I've been in New York the entire time, watching, waiting, documenting every single move you made." He began pacing in front of the wounded man, his hands clasped behind his back. "You see, Marco, about 4 months before my supposed departure, I started hearing whispers. Little things, conversations that stopped when I entered a room, phone calls that ended too quickly, meetings that I wasn't invited to for the first time in 15 years. So I decided to conduct a little experiment." Tommy was staring at his boss with something approaching awe. The Sicily story was complete bullshit. Vinny smiled genuinely for the first time since entering the warehouse. "I've been living in a safe house in Queens, Marco. Watching you through cameras I had installed in every property we owned. Listening to your phone calls through taps I set up months ago. Learning which of my people were loyal and which were just waiting for the right moment to stick a knife in my back." Marco tried to shift position and winced as pain shot through his leg. "Why? If you knew I was planning to move against you, why not just kill me?" "Because I needed to know how deep this went. I needed to see who would stand with you and who would stand with me. I needed to understand exactly how you planned to destroy everything I built." Vinny's voice hardened. "And I needed you to commit crimes serious enough that when I finally moved against you, no one in our world would question my response." The warehouse filled with the sound of approaching vehicles, multiple engines, car doors slamming. Marco's head snapped toward the sound, hope flickering in his eyes. "Expecting someone?" Vinny asked mildly. Before Marco could answer, the main door rolled open with a grinding of metal on metal. 6 men entered, and Marco's hope died as he recognized them. All soldiers from Vinny's crew, all men he'd tried to recruit over the past 3 years. "Evening, boss," called out Sal Benedetto, Mrs. Benedetto's nephew and Vinny's most trusted enforcer. "We brought the files you wanted." "Files?" Marco's voice was barely a whisper. Sal dropped a thick manila folder at Vinny's feet. "So bank records, phone transcripts, meeting notes, photographs. 3 years worth of documentation of conspiracy, embezzlement, and attempted coup against a made man." Vinny picked up the folder and hefted its weight. You know what this represents, Marco? This is evidence of treason against the family. In the old days, there would be no trial, no discussion, no second chances. Vinny, please. But we don't live in the old days anymore, do we? We live in a world of lawyers and plea bargains and witness protection programs. We live in a world where loyalty is negotiable, and honor is a luxury we can't afford. He opened the folder and pulled out a photograph. Marco shaking hands with Joey Castellano outside the bakery. So I'm going to offer you something our fathers never would have. A choice. Marco's breathing was labored now, whether from blood loss or fear. Vinny couldn't tell. What kind of choice? Option 1. I turn this evidence over to the commission. They'll convene a tribunal, hear the evidence, and order your execution. It'll be quick, professional, and your family will be provided for according to tradition. And option 2, Vinny smiled, and this time there was no warmth in it at all. Option 2, you work for me, really work for me, this time. You help me rebuild everything you tore down. You identify every person who conspired with you, and you spend the rest of your life proving that Vincent Torino's mercy is more terrifying than his wrath. The warehouse fell silent except for the distant sounds of the city and Marco's labored breathing. Finally, Marco raised his head and looked directly into Vinny's eyes. If I choose option 2, how do I know you won't kill me anyway once I've given you what you want? You don't, Vinny replied simply. But you know for certain what happens if you choose option 1. Marco closed his eyes, and for a moment he looked like a man much older than his 43 years. When he opened them again, there was resignation in his gaze. I choose option 2. Smart man, Vinny nodded to Tommy. Get him to Doc Morelli. Fix him up but keep him under guard. We start rebuilding tomorrow. As Tommy and 2 other men helped Marco to his feet, Vinny called out one final instruction. Marco, when we're done rebuilding, when every business is reopened and every debt is collected, when the Torino name once again means something on these streets, that's when you'll truly understand the difference between betraying me and serving me. 6 weeks after the warehouse confrontation, Vincent Torino sat in the back booth of Torino's restaurant, watching steam rise from his espresso cup. The establishment looked almost exactly as it had before his supposed departure. Red checkered tablecloths, black and white photos of Sicily on the walls, the smell of garlic and basil heavy in the air. The only difference was the man behind the bar, Marco Santangelo, his right arm in a sling but his movements efficient as he restocked glasses. The lunch crowd's been good, reported Sal Benedetto, sliding into the booth across from Vinny. Word's getting out that you're back, that things are returning to normal. Gino reopened the social club yesterday, and 3 of the old card games are running again. Vinny nodded, his eyes never leaving Marco. What about the money? Recovered about 60% so far. Marco's been very cooperative in identifying the accounts. Turns out he wasn't as clever at hiding money as he thought he was. And Joey Castellano. Sal's expression hardened. That's more complicated. He's claiming he never conspired against you. Says Marco approached him but he turned him down. Problem is, we've got photos and phone records that suggest otherwise. Suggestions aren't proof, Sal. In our business, accusations without solid evidence can start wars. Vinny sipped his espresso, savoring the bitter warmth. What does Marco say? He backs up Joey's story. Says he approached the Castellanos but they weren't interested in supporting a move against you. Vinny studied his enforcer's face. But you don't believe him. I think Marco's protecting someone. Question is whether it's Joey or someone higher up in the Castellano organization. The restaurant's front door chimed, and Vinny looked up to see a familiar figure entering. Detective Ray Morrison of the NYPD's Organized Crime Task Force shook rainwater from his coat and scanned the room with the practiced eye of a cop who'd spent 20 years walking the thin line between law enforcement and the street. Well, Morrison said, approaching their booth with a slight smile. Vincent Torino, heard you were back in town. Detective Morrison. Vinny gestured to the empty seat beside Sal. Join us for coffee? Can't say no to that. Morrison settled into the booth, his bulk making the vinyl creak. He was a big man, Irish-American with graying red hair and the kind of face that could shift from friendly to intimidating in the space of a heartbeat. How was Sicily? I heard the weather's beautiful this time of year. Wouldn't know, Vinny replied easily. I spent the last few months in Queens, catching up on some reading. Morrison's smile widened. Funny thing, we had surveillance on this place the whole time you were supposedly gone. Never saw you leave the city. Maybe your surveillance wasn't as good as you thought. Or maybe, Morrison leaned forward, lowering his voice. You've been running a very sophisticated operation right under our noses. The kind of operation that would require detailed planning, multiple safe houses, and a level of paranoia that frankly impresses the hell out of me. Sal tensed beside him, but Vinny remained relaxed. He'd been dealing with Morrison for 8 years, ever since the detective had taken over the organized crime beat. They had what could charitably be called a professional relationship. Morrison investigated, Vinny evaded, and occasionally they exchanged information when it served both their interests. You didn't come here to compliment my operational security, Ray. No, I didn't. Morrison glanced around the restaurant, noting the placement of Marco behind the bar, the way Sal's hand rested casually near his jacket. I came to give you a heads up. There's talk at One Police Plaza about bringing in federal resources for a major organized crime sweep. Word is, someone's been feeding information to the Bureau about activities in Little Italy. Vinny felt a cold knot form in his stomach, but his expression didn't change. Information about what activities? Money laundering, extortion, conspiracy charges. The kind of information that could only come from someone with detailed knowledge of your operation. Morrison's eyes flicked toward Marco. Someone on the inside. The implication hung in the air between them. Vinny's fingers drummed once against the table, a momentary lapse that Morrison didn't miss. When? Vinny asked. Soon. Maybe days, maybe weeks. But Vinny, Morrison leaned even closer. These aren't locals anymore. The feds have been building a RICO case, and they're not interested in the usual arrangements. They want to make examples. After Morrison left, Vinny sat in silence for several minutes. Sal waited, understanding that his boss was processing information, calculating risks, formulating plans. Marco, Vinny called out finally. His former lieutenant approached the booth, moving carefully on his still healing leg. Yeah, boss. Sit down. Marco slid into Morrison's vacated seat, his eyes wary. Something wrong. You tell me. Vinny's voice was soft, dangerous. Detective Morrison seems to think someone's been talking to the feds. Someone with intimate knowledge of our operations. Vinny, I swear on my mother's grave. Your mother's still alive, Marco. She lives in that nice house in New Rochelle that I helped you buy for her 3 years ago. Vinny's eyes bored into Marco's. So let's try this again. Have you been talking to federal agents? Marco's face went pale, but his voice was steady. No, I haven't talked to any feds. I haven't talked to anybody except the people in this room. Vinny studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I believe you. Relief flooded Marco's features. Thank you, boss. I know I fucked up, but I would never. Which means, Vinny continued as if Marco hadn't spoken, that whoever's talking to the feds was already talking to them before your little coup attempt. Someone who's been feeding information for months, maybe years. The realization hit both Marco and Sal simultaneously. If someone had been informing for an extended period, it meant the entire organization had been compromised long before Marco's betrayal. It meant that Vinny's 3-year deception might have been observed, documented, and reported to federal authorities. Jesus Christ, Marco whispered. We're all fucked. Maybe, Vinny agreed. Or maybe this is exactly the opportunity we've been waiting for. He stood up from the booth, dropping a 20 on the table. Sal, I want you to reach out to our friends in the Genovese family. Tell them Vincent Torino would like to arrange a meeting. Tonight. What are you planning, boss? Vinny smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it reached his eyes. I'm planning to turn a disaster into a triumph. And if we're very lucky, we're going to identify our informant in the process. As he walked toward the restaurant's back exit, Vinny called over his shoulder. Oh, and Sal, bring Marco to the meeting. If we're walking into a trap, I want to make sure we're all in it together. The meeting took place in the basement of Carmine Genovese's funeral parlor on Hester Street, a location chosen for both its privacy and its symbolic resonance. 6 men sat around a folding table under harsh fluorescent lights, the air thick with cigarette smoke, and the faint smell of formaldehyde from upstairs. Carmine Genovese, at 68, was one of the last of the old-school bosses. His face was a roadmap of scars and wrinkles, his white hair slicked back in a style that hadn't changed since 1975. Beside him sat his underboss, Fat Tony Marconi, whose 300-pound frame made the folding chair groan with each breath. "Vincent," Carmine wheezed, lighting another cigarette despite the oxygen tank that followed him everywhere. "You look good for a dead man. Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated," Vinny replied, settling into his chair with Marco beside him. Sal stood by the door, his bulk blocking the only exit. "So I hear, 3 years you let people think you were gone. Let your own lieutenant carve up your territory like a Thanksgiving turkey." Carmine's laugh turned into a coughing fit. "Either you're the smartest son of a bitch in New York, or you're completely fucking crazy. Little of both, probably." Fat Tony leaned forward, the table creaking under his weight. "Word is the feds are planning something big. RICO indictments, the whole 9 yards. You bring us here to ask for help running. I brought you here to offer you an opportunity." Vinny pulled out a manila folder and placed it on the table. "Everything in here documents 3 years of criminal activity by my organization. Bank records, meeting notes, recorded conversations, photographic evidence." Carmine's eyes narrowed. "You wearing a wire, Vincent? Search me if you want. But first, let me explain what I'm offering." Vinny opened the folder, revealing the first page, a detailed organizational chart of his operation. "This information is worth millions to federal prosecutors. It could put half the made men in Manhattan away for life. And you're just giving it to us." Fat Tony's voice dripped suspicion. "I'm giving it to you because tomorrow morning, this folder is going to be delivered to the FBI field office in Lower Manhattan, along with a signed confession from Marco Santangelo detailing his 3-year conspiracy to take over my organization." Marco jerked in his seat. "What? Vinny, we had a deal." "We had a deal," Vinny agreed calmly. "You help me rebuild. You identify your co-conspirators and when I don't kill you. But I never said anything about not throwing you to the feds. You bastard." Sal's hand landed heavily on Marco's shoulder, pushing him back into his chair. Duos ain't finished talking. Carmine was studying the documents with the intensity of a man who'd spent 50 years avoiding federal prosecution. "This is detailed, too detailed. How did you gather all this information? Surveillance, wiretaps, hidden cameras. For 3 years, I documented every crime committed by my organization while I was supposedly in exile." Vinny's voice was matter-of-fact. "The beauty is, it's all inadmissible in court. Because you gathered it illegally," Fat Tony said, understanding dawning in his small eyes. "Exactly, but inadmissible doesn't mean useless. The FBI will use this as a roadmap to build new cases, gather legal evidence, flip witnesses." Vinny closed the folder. "Unless, of course, they're too busy investigating other crimes to focus on old business." Carmine stubbed out his cigarette and immediately lit another. "What other crimes?" "The kind that would require federal resources to investigate. The kind that would make pursuing my organization seem like small potatoes." Vinny smiled. "I'm talking about a major bust. Multiple families, hundreds of millions in assets, crimes that make national headlines. You're talking about selling out other families. I'm talking about controlled demolition. We pick which organizations get sacrificed. We make sure our own people are protected, and we use the chaos to consolidate power." Vinny leaned forward. "When the smoke clears, there will be fewer families in New York, but the ones that survive will be stronger than ever." The basement fell silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and Carmine's labored breathing. Both older men were calculating odds, weighing risks against potential rewards. "What do you need from us?" Carmine asked finally. "Access to the Colombo family's drug operations in Brooklyn. Specifically, their heroin distribution network." Vinny's request was delivered like he was asking for directions to the subway. "I need enough evidence to convince the feds that they're running the largest narcotics operation on the East Coast." Fat Tony whistled softly. "You want us to help you destroy the Colombos?" "I want us to survive what's coming. The feds are going to move whether we help them or not. At least this way, we control which targets they hit." Marco had been listening with growing horror. "You're talking about betraying everything we stand for. The code, loyalty, family." "The code?" Vinny's voice turned ice cold. You want to lecture me about the code? You, who tried to steal my organization while I was away. You, who would have had me killed if you'd been smart enough to think of it. That was different. That was exactly the same. The only difference is scale. Vinny turned back to Carmine. The world has changed, Carmine. We adapt or we die. And I'd rather control the process of change than be destroyed by it. Carmine was quiet for a long moment, studying Vinny's face. If we do this, if we help you set up the Columbos, what guarantee do we have that you won't do the same to us? You have my word. Your word. Carmine laughed, another coughing fit following. The word of a man who just spent 3 years lying to everyone he knows. The word of a man who could have destroyed you all years ago, but chose partnership instead. Vinny's voice was steady. I've had dirt on your operations since 2018. I could have traded it for immunity anytime I wanted. Instead, I'm here offering you a chance to profit from the coming chaos. Fat Tony was studying the organizational chart. This is incredibly detailed. You really documented everything. Everything. Names, dates, amounts, methods. 3 years of criminal activity by over 40 made men and associates. Vinny's smile was predatory. The question is, do you want to help me decide how this information gets used? Or do you want to wait and see what the feds do with it on their own? Carmine made his decision with a decisive nod. What do you need us to do? 3 months later, Vincent Torino stood on the observation deck of the Staten Island ferry, watching the Manhattan skyline shrink in the distance. The November wind was bitter, cutting through his wool coat and making his eyes water. Beside him, Detective Ray Morrison huddled in a worn leather jacket, a cigarette cupped in his hands. Hell of a thing, Morrison said, exhaling smoke that was immediately whipped away by the wind. 37 indictments, 15 families destroyed, over $200 million in assets seized. The Bureau's calling it the biggest organized crime bust in New York history. Biggest so far, Vinny corrected. The morning newspapers had been full of headlines about the massive federal operation that had swept through Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx like a hurricane. The Colombo family had been devastated, their leadership structure completely dismantled. 3 smaller families had been eliminated entirely. Even some Genovese operations had been caught up in the dragnet, though Carmine himself had somehow avoided indictment. Your boy Marco's been singing like a canary, Morrison continued. 20-year sentence reduced to 8 with his cooperation. Of course, he'll probably do about 4 if he keeps being helpful. Marco always was a pragmatist. Is that what you call it? Morrison flicked his cigarette into the churning water. I call it survival, just like what you did. Vinny turned to study the detective's profile. After 8 years of cat and mouse, Morrison still surprised him sometimes. What do you think I did, Ray? I think you orchestrated the most elaborate setup in the history of organized crime. I think you spent 3 years documenting crimes, gathering evidence and positioning yourself to destroy your enemies while protecting your friends. Morrison's smile was admiring. And I think you're either the smartest criminal I've ever met, or the luckiest. Maybe both. The ferry was approaching the St. George terminal, and early commuters were beginning to gather near the exits. Vinny checked his watch, 7:30 a.m. In 2 hours, he had a meeting with his lawyers to discuss the federal investigation into his own organization, the investigation that had quietly stalled when more attractive targets presented themselves. You know what I can't figure out, Morrison said as they walked toward the gangway. How you managed to stay 1 step ahead of your informant. Vinny stopped walking. My what? Come on, Vincent. You think we didn't know? Someone in your organization has been feeding information to federal agents for over 4 years. Someone close to you. Someone who knew about the Sicily deception from the beginning. The crowd flowed around them as Vinny processed this information. 4 years of surveillance meant the informant had been in place long before Marco's betrayal, long before his elaborate setup, someone who had watched him plan and execute the most complex criminal enterprise of his career. Who? Vinny asked quietly. Morrison's smile was enigmatic. That would be telling, but I will say this. Whoever it is has been very selective about what information gets passed along. Certain crimes documented, others mysteriously overlooked. It's almost like they were protecting you while they were betraying you. The ferry docked with a shuddering impact that ran through the deck. Passengers began streaming toward the exits, their morning conversations a backdrop to Vinny's racing thoughts. Why are you telling me this? Because, in about 6 hours, that informant is going to receive a call telling them their services are no longer required. The Bureau's got what they need from the Colombian operation, and frankly, your organization isn't worth the resources anymore. Morrison paused at the gangway. Figured you deserved to know that your protection is about to expire. As Morrison disappeared into the crowd of commuters, Vinny remained on the deck, staring out at the gray waters of New York Harbor. 4 years. Someone had been watching him for 4 years, documenting his activities, reporting to federal agents. Someone close enough to know about the Sicily deception, but selective enough to protect him from the worst consequences. He pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. Sal, it's me. I need you to do something, and I need you to do it quietly. Vinny's voice was calm, but his fingers were drumming against the ferry's railing. I need you to review everyone who had access to our operation over the past 4 years. Everyone who knew about Sicily. Everyone who was involved in the surveillance setup. Everyone who could have documented our activities. Boss, that's a lot of people. Start with family, Sal. Start with the people closest to me. Vinny hung up and walked toward the terminal, his mind working through possibilities. As he stepped onto the gangway, his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Congratulations on your victory. Hope it was worth it. A friend. He stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it. But as he walked through the terminal toward his waiting car, Vincent Torino couldn't shake the feeling that his greatest challenge wasn't behind him. It was just beginning. The game had changed again, and this time he wasn't sure he understood all the rules. In the distance, Manhattan's skyline gleamed in the morning sun, its towers reaching toward a sky that held both promise and threat. Somewhere in those buildings, federal agents were closing files and opening new ones. Somewhere, a phone was ringing, and a 4-year relationship was coming to an end. And somewhere, Vincent Torino's carefully constructed world was about to be tested in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The ferry pulled away from the dock, carrying its cargo of commuters toward their uncertain futures. And on the observation deck, a seagull landed where Vinny had been standing, cocking its head as if listening for secrets in the wind. But the only sound was the churning of water and the distant rumble of a city that never stopped moving, never stopped changing, and never forgot to collect on its debts.